3 to 4 million podcasts out there. That's on Listen Notes, which I'm sure you know, it's like a podcast directory. But of those 3 to 4 million podcasts, only less than 500,000 are active. So already the amount of people you're competing with to reach your audience is so small. And another stat I found on Amplify and Pod News was that 44% of podcasts have less than 3 episodes, and only 156,000 podcasts are released on a weekly basis. So like if you're releasing a weekly podcast, you're essentially competing with 156,000 other episodes. So already, as I say, you're getting, like, just to put it into perspective, there's 200 million Instagram business accounts. So you're already like competing with so many less people to get your message across.
Welcome to Tech for Founders podcast. I'm your host, Panida, and today we have a very special guest, Maria. Maria is an ex-journalist and radio producer who is now traveling the world while producing and managing podcasts for businesses and individuals. She is also the host of her own podcast called Recipe to the Road, which aims to make travel more accessible through information. In this interview, we will be discussing how podcasting can help businesses better connect with their audience. Maria will be sharing her expertise on the benefits of podcasting for businesses, common mistakes to avoid, and strategies for creating emotionally compelling content, and much more. She will also be sharing her thoughts on how to incorporate sustainable practices into podcast production and management. So, if you're a business owner looking to enhance your connection with your audience, you won't want to miss out on this episode. Maria, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. I'm really excited to dive into our discussion and share your insights with our listeners. Welcome to Tech for Founders, the podcast that helps non-technical founders leverage technology in their businesses. Follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to stay tuned for new episodes.
Morning. Hi, how are you?
Morning. Thanks so much for joining from so far away.
Oh yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
So let's get started. So can you tell us a bit more about your background in podcasting and how you got started in this field?
Yeah, so I'll jump back to, so I was in college studying business or studying commerce, and it was fine, but I just didn't really see what I was going to do with that afterwards. So I went and did a master's in journalism, which is something that a lot of people had told me I should do, but I never actually ended up doing it. I don't know. I just didn't really see what I could do with it, or I thought it was too competitive. But then I realized that no, like this is actually something I really enjoy, and I need to do something I really enjoy. So I did my master's in journalism, and I loved it. Like it was the first time in my in my studies where I felt like it was just that I was on the right path. I was doing the right thing. Like the workload was so much, but I didn't even mind because I just loved it. And then in particular, I loved like kind of multimedia. And like I really enjoyed working with audio. So I did that. As I came to the end then, like I was like, right, now I want to try work in radio, which like out of the journalism fields is like very, like journalism, all the fields are quite competitive, but I think radio was quite competitive. But I was like, do you know what? I'm just going to give it a go for a year, see how I get on. So I was kind of working like multiple jobs because like freelance jobs here and there. So I was working in a radio station doing like holiday cover, and then I was working in a multimedia production company, and I can't remember. I was working in a bar for a while too. There was a stage where I had like 5 or 6 different jobs that I was kind of going to every week for like a few hours here and there. And in the multimedia company, actually, it was where I saw that there's more you can do with journalism than just actually work in news. And like I loved working in news, that was still my goal, but I was kind of like, oh, I'm going to bank that in the back of my head because this is something. So I continued working radio, got to the stage where I was doing news journalism, and I was producing a current affairs show, which again, absolutely loved. It was so interesting, both of them. I love the buzz of live radio, but at the same time, I knew that wasn't something like I had to make a decision to either like stay in Ireland and keep building up my profile in radio or journalism of any sort, or travel and just take a chance that I would kind of lose that progress I'd made. But my partner and I had talked about moving to Vancouver in Canada, and we'd always wanted to kind of like see the world. So I went over there. It was January 2020. So you know what's happening, what's coming. And we were kind of looking for jobs, getting settled, and then yeah, COVID hit. So I had a friend working in like a finance place. Like COVID hadn't really like hit yet, but I just was getting a bit nervous that I hadn't really made much progress in the job hunt. And everyone says that over there, like it takes a while to get into a job. And my friend was like, look, I work in this place. It's like a really good job. They're looking for people right now. Like you'll be working within 2 weeks. Like, yeah, do you know what? Perfect. So I started there on the 16th of March 2020. So literally like the day the borders closed coming into Canada. So I was just so grateful to have a job that like any kind of like looking for anything else, I just like, you know, I'm just going to put that to the side. I'm just going to be grateful. Just going to see how this like pandemic thing pans out, thinking it'll be all back to normal in like a month or two. And then like, because we were in Vancouver, like there's obviously so much to do and so much to see that I just sort of like, even when the pandemic eased off of it, I just kind of was like, you know what, this is working for me for now. But after a while, I was like, no, I am missing like I guess the independence of like radio production. I'm missing the buzz. I'm missing all of that. So I started looking up online like freelance work in audio editing. So I found there's like a website Fiverr, or a friend recommended it to me. So I found on that and I started doing like editing bits on there. And I realized there was actually quite a market. Around the same time, then we were coming to the end of our visa in Canada, and because of the pandemic, there was a huge backlog in getting like so you get a 2-year visa, and then the next stage is to get a 5-year visa, and that's a lot harder to get. And because of the pandemic, there was like so many delays. I think they even like closed it down altogether for a little while because it was so backlogged. So we didn't really have a choice. We had to leave. So we took advantage of that to come traveling. The place that with the pandemic that seemed to be the most consistent with like I guess like policies and like border policies was Central America and Mexico. And even like Mexico in itself was so big that we were like, at least if we go there, and we end up just staying like in a small area of Mexico, there's so much to see. So we're like, right, we'll go there. But we heard it was a bit more expensive. So I was like, oh, well, I'll keep trying this like freelancing thing and do that. So when I kind of came to Mexico, or we started in Mexico, that's when I was like, right, I'm going to really like put effort into this. Cause like, as it was more expensive. So we did need to like earn money as we traveled. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to give it a go. I started a website. I did all the things I thought you had to do to start a business. And yeah, that was just over a year ago. So Creatively Contenting, my business was a year at the beginning of May there. Yeah, I guess that's how I got to here.
Well, that's a very impressive background. I think one of the themes that I see is that you're very adaptable. And I think it's so useful, especially in this like technological world, because radio is so hard to get in because only a few people can be on the radio. But with podcasting and all these new digital things, I guess it's more democratized in a way. And you kind of took advantage of that and got into freelancing during COVID, which is essentially the story that we read on the news. Wow, someone like changed their career during COVID. And I think it's just really amazing that you took that obstacle into an opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it really did make us all kind of like take a reset, didn't it? Because everything slowed down that like, well, not everyone, but some people got the opportunity to really just like reset and reassess things and maybe focus on yourself for a while. And then in doing that, you sort of figure out what you really want to do.
Yes. And let's ask the next question. How can podcasting help businesses better connect with their audience, and what are some benefits that they can expect to see?
Yeah, I love this question. I actually have an article on my blog about, or a post on my blog about it. But so there's I have it divided up into about 5 ways that podcasting can really help businesses. So I always like to start with a few stats. So there's 3 to 4 million podcasts out there. That's on Listen Notes, which I'm sure you know, it's like a podcast directory. But of those 3 to 4 million podcasts, only less than 500,000 are active. So already the amount of people you're competing with to reach your audience is so small. And another stat I found on Amplify and Pod News was that 44% of podcasts have less than 3 episodes, and only 156,000 podcasts are released on a weekly basis. So like if you're releasing a weekly podcast, you're essentially competing with 156,000 other episodes. So already, as I say, you're getting, like, just to put it into perspective, there's 200 million Instagram business accounts. So you're already like competing with so many less people to get your message across. And then with that, in Ireland, 46% of people in 2022 listened to a podcast in the last month. Those stats are in the UK, it's 37% of people, or sorry, in the US, it's 37% of people. In the UK, it's 25% of people. And I really should have had a stat ready for Thailand, so I do apologize.
All right.
But I feel like those stats, like somewhere between that 25 to 46% mark, seem to be consistent across a lot of markets in the world. So it's a really, really good way to expand your audience. Then when you actually do have an audience, they're likely to trust you a lot more as a podcast host than other mediums of contacting your audience. So again, some more research by iHeartMedia and PMX, people said that radio and podcast hosts are perceived as the most trustworthy, essential, and relatable personalities in the media ecosystem. So wow. So if you're saying something on a podcast, obviously it has to be the truth, but people are more likely to listen to it. And as I always do say, take that trust seriously. Don't, as a business, you should never do anything to lose it. You really should respect that. And then I guess to come on to my third point, it sort of links in with that, is podcasts create intimacy. So when it's probably why people will trust a podcast host more, is because it's more intimate medium. There's actually a book about it by someone called Alan Urich called Podcasting as an Intimate Medium. And it's that you have that co-presence between the listener and the host, because people could be listening to podcasts while they're brushing their teeth. They're listening to podcasts while they're driving in the car on their own. They listen to podcasts in these places where you don't usually have another person there. Same as the radio. So it's just, you're just a little bit more in their lives than maybe Instagram or something like that. And then on the content side of things, with podcasting, you maintain creative control. You're not, so when you put up a podcast, you own that podcast. It's not like when you put it up on a social media and it's dependent on the algorithm and it's up on their site and whatever. With a podcast, you own the podcast, and then you put it up on different, you put it up in your host, obviously, and then it goes out to Spotify, Apple, etc. But none of them own the content. It belongs to you. It's called white label, I think. So you're somewhat dependent on an algorithm to show your podcast to people. You also will probably have a mailing list, and you'll have access to your audience in another way. So it's you're not totally dependent on an algorithm. And even at that, it's going out to so many different sites that there's going to be a different type of algorithm on each site. So it's just a little bit more, like you said at the beginning, a bit more democratized. And then the last of my 5 points why I think podcasting is really good for business is it's really good for SEO. So depending on your different host site, when you put up your podcast, it's obviously available on your host site. So say if you use Anchor or Spotify for podcasts, Podbean, the different ones. And then it'll also obviously be on Apple, Spotify. These are all websites with a really high authority. So when people search your topics, Google's going to be like, oh, well, Podbean has a high authority and it has a little article, because obviously you put like show notes with your podcast. You'll be like, oh, there's a little article about this topic here. So it's more likely to show it than if you had it on maybe a newly formed website. So you kind of get to like jump ahead in the SEO game as well. And yeah, obviously, as I said, write show notes. So I'm a big stickler for like good show notes. I think write them as if you're writing a blog post. So you'll have like your headings and then your paragraph and your headings and your paragraph. So it's divided up so that Google can kind of like understand what's going on in it when it's crawlers are in searching for SEO. But yeah, I think they're like my main reasons. I think businesses really benefit from podcasting.
Yeah, those are very good reasons, especially the first one. The numbers are absolutely crazy. It's like
Right?
we're competing with so few people in comparison to Instagram, because everyone's popping up trying to be an influencer on Instagram. And I think podcasting is a huge opportunity now.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people say like, oh, I'm too late to get into podcasting. Like you're really not. Or you hear people say, oh, everyone has a podcast. It's like maybe a lot of people started a podcast, but not a lot of people continued one, or not a lot of people have a regular podcast.
It's true. And so what are the common mistakes that you think businesses make when they start a podcast, and how would they avoid them?
Yeah, so I almost led into this there when I was chatting about the last thing. But the first thing I think is failure to plan. And to bring it back to that first point in my last answer, I think that's a huge reason why there are 3 to 4 million podcasts out there, but only 500,000, less than 500,000 active podcasts. Like I don't think people really do enough research into like the production process of podcasting. Like it is time consuming. Like there's I was reading something the other day about a new podcast, and they put in like the production time, and they said they spend 10 hours a week like on everything to do with this podcast. And at first I was like, oh, that's a long time. I was like, actually, no, because you have your recording, you have your guest management, like, you know, all in all, you probably do spend that much time, or maybe a bit less. Like if you bulk do your tasks, like you do all your guest management for the next month in one go or something like that, like you might reduce it a bit. But essentially, it is a lot of time. And like editing a podcast will take about 4 times the length of the podcast. That's kind of like a rule of thumb. Sorry, there's just a bit of background noise there. Apologies for that. Yeah, so as a rule of thumb, it will take about 4 times the amount of time to edit a podcast as the length of the audio. So I think that's a huge thing. Not getting podcast manager. No, I'm sure there's plenty of people who do it without a podcast manager and they get on fine. But I do think like maybe weigh up, is your time worth the amount of time that you need to put into a podcast? And if not, is it something that you should outsource rather than wasting like your valuable time, which is probably like, if you're not a podcast manager, it's going to take you longer to do something that a podcast manager could do shorter. So it ends up costing more. That's kind of the way I look at it. Like,
yeah, definitely. I think a lot of businesses, they underestimate the time it takes to produce content. Because when you look at content, it's like 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and you think, oh, that's it. Oh, that's all I have to do. But it's not true. When you go into it, it's very time consuming. And I think outsourcing for businesses seems like a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Like outsource what you're not pro at, or what's like wasting the most time. I think I'm really a big fan of that. Some other kind of mistakes and stuff will be like a bad recording. Like if there is background noise, like a huge one, it's not an issue in Ireland or a lot of places in Europe, but like if you've like an air conditioner, like make sure that that's turned off, or like a fan or something like that, which is obviously like quite tough in warmer countries. But things like that can like really cause like a hum in the background, which can be quite distracting when people are listening. Not warming up before a podcast. I think like I tell people to do like the silliest warm-ups and like jump around, like sing, do like your tongue twisters, like, you know, that maybe do when you're a kid and you're like saying little like poems, like all that kind of stuff to just like get your brain working, get your mouth working, get your energy flowing. Not identifying their target audience, I think, is a huge mistake. Like this isn't just specific to podcasting, of course. This is in any sort of type of marketing, social media, that kind of thing. Because you need to know who you're talking to. Like I go as far as getting people to I have like a user persona sheet, and I get people to like create a personality for their podcast listener. A lot of people they don't get it. They're like, why do I have to give them a name? Like, no, you need to give them a name so that you know you're talking to James. He's 32. He has one kid. He's just bought a house. Like, because that way when you're talking, you're better targeting them. You're better speaking in the way they understand. And that doesn't mean the only people that listen are called James and they're 32. It just means that you're clear in your marketing of your podcast, you're clear in your messaging. And if someone else enjoys that, amazing. And someone else will enjoy it, because it's not like things are specific to male 32-year-olds, like I just think sorry, I'm jumping around. Like it does just really help as a host to know exactly who you're talking to and picture them. If there's any kind of decisions to be made, or you're wondering what kind of content to do next, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Definitely. I think the dream customer thing is so useful for any business, any kind of business.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, just make sure, like, once you identify them, make sure you're speaking to them as well, not just that you have it on a page somewhere. It's like, actually, no, you need to speak to them and think about them. And then, like, I think not remembering that the guest is doing you a favor. I think sometimes it can be nearly a bit transactional in getting podcast guests. And as a podcast host, businesses, anyone, but we're talking about businesses, need to remember that the guest is taking time out of their day for free. Like, yeah, they'll get a bit of exposure, like that could benefit them, but really they're providing you with content, which is going to help your business. So I'm not saying now you have to give them a present or something like that, but I'm just saying, like, treat their time as if it's valuable, like make it a good experience for them.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I think it's important to be grateful for the people who come and help you on your podcasting journey as well. It's like you're not doing this all alone, and it's impossible to do things alone. Right?
Absolutely. And I'll just note, our entire communication has been, I've felt very appreciated. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. So you mentioned that sustainability is important to you and your work. And how would you incorporate sustainable practices into podcast production? And what advice do you have for businesses looking to do this?
Yeah, so I think it's like, to come back to the planning thing again, I think it's figuring out what they have available to them, and again, to come back to that stat of like only 156,000 podcasts being out each week, that's because people started a podcast and they didn't have a sustainable routine or something, or production process in place. So I think like that's a huge thing. Like, you need to figure out what you have available to you and if what you're doing will be sustainable. So, for example, maybe you don't have 5 hours a week, because I honestly feel like if you're completely self-producing, you're going to need a minimum of 5 hours a week to get a podcast episode out. Like, maybe over time you'll get it down, but realistically, so if you don't have 5 hours a week to spare, I would say maybe look at preparing like 8 episodes in advance and doing an 8-episode season. And you don't even launch, you don't do anything. Maybe you release a trailer, but until those 8 episodes are done, you do not launch. And then you really schedule them and have them to go out each week. So that's kind of like how I see like being sustainable with your time and your kind of like ongoing, like keeping the podcast going. Financially as well, like I will talk, a lot of clients will say, oh, do I need to if they're starting a podcast from scratch, they'll be like, oh, do I need to get a microphone? like, well, do you have the budget for a microphone? Do you think that this is something you're going to do like for a while? Because honestly, like, while a microphone, it obviously is going to be better if it's obviously like a good microphone. But a lot of people have a very, very good mic on their smartphone. Like, I think iPhone, and there's another brand, ZTE. I used to have a phone with the ZTE brand, and the microphone, the audio recorder on it was the best audio recorder I think I've ever used. Now, it was a few years ago, so maybe if I compared it to something I've used now, it wouldn't be. But like, there's some smartphones have really, really good microphones. I have a Motorola now. It's not the best, but it is a couple of years old, so maybe that's why. But a lot of smartphones have a really good mic. So if you're like starting a podcast, it might not be sustainable for you to invest in all this equipment straight away. You might not even like podcasting. You mightn't have the time. You know. So I'm not saying that you're doomed to fail or anything, but I'm just saying don't like waste your money at the beginning on like fancy equipment. Just like use a smartphone, get started, record your 8 episodes, do what's available to you. So when I kind of talk about sustainability in my practice, that's kind of how I mean, like, what's sustainable practices for clients to keep the podcast going as long as they would like to.
Yeah, I really like that because I think when you overcomplicate things and you have to buy all this equipment and you have to buy all this software and prepare, it just becomes overcomplicated that you don't get the main task done. And I think getting the main task done is all you really need.
Yeah, exactly. It can be overwhelming. You're dead right there.
And so, how would you approach creating emotionally compelling content that resonates with audience? And what tips do you have for businesses?
Yeah. So I think, to come back again to what I was saying about target audience, I think that's like the biggest thing in creating emotionally compelling content, because you need to know what makes your audience tick. And while I was talking about target audience there, I was kind of talking about identifying them. Some things I didn't mention actually about identifying them is like, you can do like polls on your podcast Instagram, and you can put maybe even a form in your show notes, like a Google form, where people can provide more information about themselves. Polls, you don't need to offer any incentive. Like, you can just put up, like, do you prefer to listen to podcasts in the evening, in the morning, something like that. And then you can ask more like, do you have kids? Yes or no? Like, so you can get information from people, just little bits here and there, and just kind of like really like listen to your audience. With the Google form, you're probably maybe going to have to offer an incentive. So that could be, if you're starting to do merch, maybe you could give them free merch or a discount code off your merch, or maybe you could just make like a free downloadable PDF depending on the topic. So like, say for example, your topic, like when it's about tech, like maybe you could have like a free downloadable PDF that was like top 5 tech things you need to know for your business in 2023. And if people complete the questionnaire, then they can download this PDF. Like, you offer like an incentive in that way for people to do the questionnaire. And like, obviously, don't ask them their mother's maiden name, their bank account number. Like, you don't have to get too specific. Just like really just trying to understand their likes and dislikes and their just what makes them tick is what I keep coming back to, figuring out their pain points. And then when you have that, and sorry, just to jump back again, another thing is even just reading comments, like under, if you post reels or something on social media, and on Spotify, if you use Spotify for podcasters to put your podcast up, there you can ask questions on each episode. So just like listening to your audience in as many places as possible. And then that really helps you understand, as I say, what makes them tick, what they want to hear. And then because of that, then you can create emotionally compelling content. And also, don't focus on like sales and advertising too much in the podcast. Like, if you're, I don't know, if you're a company making a software, like say actually, for example, McAfee, I think they did a podcast that was about something to do with computers, or maybe like hacking or something. But it was like, it wasn't about necessarily what they do. Like, it was about what they do, but it wasn't about what they do. Like, it wasn't like they're pushing down like, we're the best antivirus and you need to buy us for this reason. It was like they really like got into the reads of why they do what they do in an interesting way. So kind of figuring out as well how to like turn around your like mission statement and use it and like nearly put it to the side, but also like show people how you got to that mission statement, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I think podcasting is more it's more private and it's more personal. And I think being salesy and someone brushing their teeth in the bathroom, just a salesy person, I just don't think they would listen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
It'll
like
just
that.
make you uncomfortable.
Definitely. And so what would you think are the biggest challenge that businesses face when it comes to producing a successful podcast? I think you mentioned that a bit in terms of inconsistency, but do you have any other tips?
Yeah, I think as you say, like, it's sort of going to come back to that, like the time and planning thing and realizing the podcasting does take time or a budget. If you have less budget, you need to put in more time. If you have less time, you need to put in more budget. And then also like ideas that resonate with the audience. So that comes back to your previous question, which is like getting to know your audience and creating that emotionally compelling content. Yeah.
Definitely. And so how do you think businesses can use podcasting as a tool for thought leadership and establishing themselves as experts in their industry?
Yeah. Well, it's your platform and you can literally share what you want on it. So it's essentially like an audition for, like any other speaking gigs you're going to do. Like it's like an audition or an online like CV or resume or something like that, that like you could literally say to someone, like even if it's your first time wanting to speak at maybe a conference, you can be like, well, I have this podcast, it's got 8 episodes so far. You can listen to how I sound on it. Like obviously it's not exactly the same, but you get an idea of what someone's going to be like based on their podcast. And it's also kind of like, as I say, you're in that kind of intimate format, like people are listening to you. So without even realizing that they are looking at you as a thought leader, people started to, because as you said, like they're listening to a podcast when they're brushing their teeth, when they're driving their car. So they'll just kind of naturally start being like, oh, I'm thinking about this tech topic I need to know about, but like, yeah, Panida was talking about this the other day. Yeah, actually, like you're just a bit more front and center in people's mind.
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of thought expertise and using podcasting as a way to pitch for other speaking roles is definitely would be great for businesses.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a bit about any particular memorable podcasting project that you've worked on and what you learned from it?
Yeah. So, I just love podcasting. I really do. So this is kind of hard for me to think about. And so I'm going to give you two examples. One, I'm going to be a little bit self-promotory and say, so I started my own podcast about travel, which is like what it's like to, or basically to try and enable more people to travel through information, because I realized in planning any of my travels that where I get the most information is by asking people who have already done it, rather than like blogs are sort of like that, but like um sometimes maybe they're not answering the right questions or the questions that I want to hear. So I wanted to start a podcast and pick the brains of people who have traveled in all different ways. Now, when I decided to start the podcast, I was like, oh, I'll be going traveling. I'll have loads of free time to start a podcast. Not really estimating how much time it takes to start a business. So it was a lot, especially getting the launch off. But because of that, I'm so proud of it. I launched in January, was like, I was recovering from COVID and I was launching a couple other podcasts at the same time. So it was a lot on my plate, but it was something I'm really proud of. So that's definitely one thing. Because it was my own podcast, like I'd worked on other people's podcasts so many times. Because it was my own podcast, I really got to understand podcasting on like what it's like to be one of my clients' levels. So I think I just like really, I'm a lot more comfortable now when I'm talking to people, because I'm like, oh, on my podcast I did it this way, or on my podcast I ran into this issue. So I think like that really, really helped. And like, as I said, I had worked on podcasts in the multimedia company and like helping other people, but really just having my own podcast helped with that. And then like, I guess the other one that sort of stands out to me is, I'm not going to name names because I just want to, data protection or whatever. But there's a podcast where this couple, basically the man is in prison, and the two of them talk about how difficult it is for people. They're based in the US, especially people in the US of color who are in prison, to come out of prison and just like get into a regular job. So a lot of people fall back into crime. So what they talk about is they've like a business where they help people kind of provide like coaching and help people kind of set up their own businesses while they're in prison or while they're just getting out of prison, so that they can have the opportunity to build that wealth and not be depending on like paycheck to paycheck on either like a minimum wage job or like going back into crime. Because in a lot of cases, depending on where they grew up, like that might have been the only options available to them in their neighborhood, but then also have a criminal record, that might be the only options available to them. So these two people, amazing people, help people build up their skills, start businesses, so that they can make like a good amount of money and have that independence of still having their own business, but it just being legal. So that was so eye-opening to me. Like, I knew that racism was a thing. I knew that like there was like systemic racism in the US, and I'm sure other places too. I have heard about it in the US. I just didn't really know how that actually looked day to day. So what these people were doing is amazing. And then the podcast obviously was just their platform to talk about these issues and to talk about what they're doing, so that people can realize that there is a lot more options to them when they come out of prison than maybe they would have initially thought.
Wow, I think it's amazing how you get to do podcasting as your own thing and documenting your travel journey, but also making an impact on people through helping other people do podcasting for their own business.
Yeah, I love it. It's like the stories and the people. That's why I got into journalism, and that's my favorite thing about this.
We have a few minutes left, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming, and I'm sure audience learned a lot from you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and really good questions. I really enjoyed them. So thank you.
Thank you.